Arizona Territory, 1878. The wind carried a storm, but the worst of it wasn't in the sky. Brielle Trenton stood barefoot in the doorway of the church her father built with his own hands, her dress torn, her lip bleeding, and her 2 children crying behind her. The preacher's words still echoed in her ears. You brought shame into this house of God. But it was not God who had turned her out. It was the town. It was her father. It was every stare that burned into her skin for loving the wrong man, a married man. She had believed him when he said he would leave his wife. She had believed him when he said he loved her. But when she told him she was with child, he disappeared like smoke. And 2 months later, her father found out she had nowhere to go, no money. Nothing but Harper and Hallie, her twins, barely 5 years old, in the clothes on their backs. The sound of hooves on dry dirt drew her eyes up. A lone rider was coming down the road, tall in the saddle, dark hat pulled low, coat dusted in red clay. The sun dropped behind him, casting him in shadow until he drew closer. He slowed when he saw her, a woman clutching 2 children, standing in a churchyard with blood on her mouth. His horse stopped and he dismounted without a word. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked. Brielle's voice cracked. "Do I look all right?" He looked at her, quiet, steady. "No, ma'am, you look like hell found you and dragged you through it." She stared at him, something in her chest breaking open at the calm in his voice. "I got no place left." He looked at the children. Harper clung to her leg. Hallie pressed her face into Brielle's skirt. "Those yours?" "Yes, mine. I raised them alone." The cowboy nodded, took off his hat, and squatted down to eye level with the twins. "You two all right?" Harper sniffled. "Mama's hurt." He looked back up at Brielle. "What's your name?" "Brielle Trenton." He stood, offered his hand. "Russell Vaughn." She didn't take it. "You gonna hit me too?" "No, ma'am, that ain't what I do." She blinked. "What do you do?" "I help people, or try to. When they need it." Russell turned toward his horse, pulled out a canteen, and handed it to her. She drank, gagged, then drank again. He waited. When she handed it back, his eyes didn't wander, not once. "I got a place out past the ridge. Ain't much, but it's dry and quiet, and no one will come looking for you there." Brielle narrowed her eyes. "Why would you help me?" He slid the canteen back into his saddlebag. "Because somebody should have before now." She hesitated. Her children shivered behind her. The wind kicked up a swirl of dust across the churchyard. She nodded. Russell helped her up into the saddle first, then handed her the children. "Hold on tight." He walked beside the horse as they followed the trail west, the sun sinking low, the air cooling. Brielle held her children close, one arm around each of them. Her side ached where her father had struck her, and her throat still burned from screaming. It had been years since anyone had looked at her without judgment. Russell had not asked who the father was. He had not asked what she had done to deserve being thrown out. He just led her home. His cabin was a one-room place built up against a bluff. Sturdy, clean. There was a pen for his horse and a lean-to stacked with firewood. He unlocked the door and stepped back. "You and the little ones can rest inside. I'll sleep out here tonight." Brielle looked at him, unsure. "Why are you being kind?" Russell met her eyes. "Because love does not make you filthy, Brielle. It does not make you shameful. It makes you human. Someone lied to you, told you it was sin. But love made you holy." Her breath caught. She stepped inside with the children, who curled up together on the cot in the corner without a word. Russell handed her a blanket and some bread from his pack. She ate slowly, her hands shaking. Outside, the fire crackled. She watched through the window as Russell leaned back against a log, staring into the flames. He said nothing, made no move to come closer, gave her safety without demand. It had been years since she felt safe. The next morning, Russell was gone before dawn, but when she stepped outside, there was water in the bucket and a fresh rabbit cleaned and hanging by the door. For the next 3 days, he stayed nearby. He taught Harper how to feed the chickens and showed Hallie how to collect kindling without getting splinters. He said little, but he listened when the children talked. He never asked about the past. On the 4th evening, Brielle stepped outside as the sun dipped behind the bluff. Russell was chopping wood. She walked up to him, brushing her hands clean on her apron. "My father said I was a disgrace, said no man would ever want a woman who'd been ruined." He stopped, axe mid-air, then slowly lowered it. "I am not ruined," she whispered. "No," he said. You are not, she took a step closer. You really believe love can make a person holy? He looked at her, his face soft in the fading light. I do. Brielle's throat tightened. Even if it was the wrong man, Russell moved closer, slow and careful, you loved with your whole heart. That ain't wrong. What he did was wrong, but you were brave. She blinked back tears. I see you, Brielle, I see all of it, and I still see something good. She reached out, brushing her fingers to his arm. You make it feel like I can breathe again. He leaned in, close enough to feel his breath on her forehead. Then stay. Breathe here, she nodded, her voice shook. I want to. That night she slept with the door unlocked, and for the first time in years she did not dream of being left behind. Russell stayed, not just in the yard, not just in the corners of her days, but beside her. Each morning started with coffee and the sound of Harper laughing. Each evening ended with quiet talk on the porch while the twins slept, and day by day the wound in her chest began to close. Not because he fixed her, but because he never asked her to be anyone but exactly who she was, and in his arms she did not feel like a sin, she felt like something sacred. The monsoon rains came late that year, but when they did, they came hard and without apology. Thunder rolled over the high desert in long, steady waves, and the roof groaned under the weight of it. Brielle stood at the window, one hand against the sill, watching the sky break open in gray sheets. The children were on the floor behind her, pressing dried lavender into cloth pouches Russell had brought back from the trading post. Russell returned soaked to the bone, leading the mule with 2 sacks of flour and a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. His coat dripped onto the packed dirt floor as he stepped inside, and the scent of rain followed him in. Brielle didn't greet him with words. She handed him a towel and held his gaze while he dried his hair. His cheek was bruised, a raw stripe across his jaw. What happened? She asked, voice low. He glanced toward the twins, then back to her. Ran into a man outside Dry Creek. Name's Keating. He recognized you. She didn't move, said a woman like you ought to be stoned in the street, her throat closed. I disagreed. She stepped forward, reached up, and ran her thumb gently along the edge of the bruise. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. She drew a slow breath. I don't want you getting hurt on account of me. He set the rope down and met her eyes, steady as ever. If a man can't take a knock for what's right, then he ain't worth much to begin with. Later, after the children had fallen asleep on their pallet, Brielle sat beside the hearth while Russell patched a tear in his shirt. His hands moved with quiet certainty, needle flashing in the firelight. You ever been married? She asked. No, she waited, came close once. Her name was Alina, lived up near Santa Fe. We talked about it, but her father didn't want her marrying someone who couldn't give her more than a roof and a prayer. I left before she had to choose. Brielle folded her hands in her lap. Did you love her? I thought I did. Maybe I did. But it wasn't the kind of love that stays when things get hard. She nodded, eyes on the fire. What about you? He asked. Before all this, there was a boy when I was 17. He carved my name into a cottonwood tree and said he'd marry me when the war ended. He never came back. Russell set the shirt aside. You still think of him? Not often. But sometimes I wonder what he'd think of me now. He leaned forward, elbows to knees. I think he'd see a woman who carried her children through hell and still sings them to sleep every night. I think he'd be proud. She looked at him then, really looked, and something inside her shifted. The next morning the rain cleared. The sky was washed clean and the mesquite sparkled with droplets. Russell saddled his horse and packed a tin of coffee and hardtack for the trail. Where are you going? Brielle asked from the doorway. Cedar Point. There's a fellow there who owes me a favor. Thought I'd ask if he's heard anything about work, something steady. Her brow creased. You don't owe me that. I'm not doing it for a debt. She hesitated. How long will you be gone? 2 days, maybe 3. Harper ran out barefoot and clung to his leg. Hallie followed, holding a pine cone she'd painted with blue clay. Russell knelt and took the cone from her gently. I'll carry it in my pack. He stood, met Brielle's eyes. You'll be all right, she nodded. We'll manage. He rode out just after dawn, and the cabin felt too still when he was gone. Brielle kept busy mending the fence, boiling lye soap, teaching the children their letters with a stick in the dirt, but her gaze drifted to the ridge each evening, waiting. On the third day, just before sunset, his horse came into view. He was dusty, tired, and smiling faintly. "I found something," he said, stepping down from the saddle. She wiped her hands on her apron. "What kind of something?" "There's a family needs help with a cattle drive. Good pay, and they'll give me a share of the herd if I stay on through winter. It's a start." She studied him. "You planning to take it?" "Not unless it means you and the children come with me." Her breath caught. It'd be rough, living out of a wagon for a time, not much comfort. "But it's honest work, and it'll get us land of our own come spring." Brielle looked back at the children, then at Russell. "We're not your burden." "No," he said. "You're my choice." She stepped forward and reached for his hand. "Then we'll go." He pulled her close, slow and sure, and pressed his forehead to hers. There was no rush, no desperation, just the quiet certainty of two people who had walked through fire and come out side by side. That night, with the storm long gone and the stars spread wide above them, Brielle lay beside him under a patchwork quilt, the children asleep near the hearth. His arm around her waist, her breath steady against his chest, she did not fear the road ahead. Because she was no longer walking it alone, by late September the land had begun to change. The mesquite pods dried and rattled in the wind, and the sky held a sharper edge. Days were still warm, but the nights came quicker, and the air held the scent of flint and dust. They struck out at first light with two wagons, one for supplies and the other for Harper and Hallie, who rode nestled among sacks of oats and folded blankets. Russell drove the lead team, reins loose in hand, while Brielle rode beside him. They followed the cattle trail west through low hills and creek beds gone to stone. The herd moved slow, and the work was steady, checking the lines, warding off strays, mending breaks in the harness. Russell never let the reins slack too long, but he talked when he could, his voice low and even. "You ever seen the Pacific?" he asked one morning as the sun crept over the ridge. Brielle shook her head. "Never been farther than Prescott." He glanced toward the horizon. "It's a strange thing, water that never ends. Makes you feel like the world might be bigger than all the heart in it." She watched the sky turn gold. "You think we'll get to see it, if we want to?" She didn't answer, but her fingers brushed against his on the seat board, and he didn't pull away. The family who'd hired Russell, the McCanns, kept mostly to themselves. There were 5 of them, an older couple, their grown son and his wife, and a girl not much older than Hallie. They drove the cattle with practiced ease and let Brielle work without question. She cooked when she could, helped wrangle strays, and saw to the children. No one asked why she was there. No one looked sideways when Russell set his bedroll beside hers each night. After 2 weeks on the trail, they reached the wintering ground, a wide plain near the Verd River, where the grass grew thick between cottonwoods. The McCanns built a rough corral and pitched canvas tents, and Russell took to scouting fence lines and digging post holes where the pasture met the tree line. Brielle found a rhythm again, the kind that wasn't about survival but living. She taught Hallie to boil coffee over an open flame without burning the bottom, and let Harper ride the older McCann's mule in slow circles until he learned to steer with his knees. She washed clothes in the river and slept under the stars with Russell beside her, his hand resting quiet over hers. One evening, after the cattle had settled and the sky turned the color of smoldering coals, Russell found her walking the riverbank with a tin pail. She crouched near the water, gathering smooth stones with flecks of quartz, and didn't look up when he approached. "You always collect rocks when you're thinking?" he asked. "Only when the thinking's hard." He squatted beside her, picking up a flat, pale one. "What's this one mean?" She took it from his palm, turning it over in her hand. "It's for the part of me that still doesn't believe this is real." Russell studied her face. "Why not?" "Because I spent long enough believing I didn't deserve peace." He waited. "I was raised to think love was something earned, that it came after obedience, after sacrifice. That it only counted if it was clean." Russell didn't speak. She looked at him, eyes steady. "You never asked me to be clean, just honest." He nodded once. "I'd rather your truth than someone else's idea of purity." She stood and held out her hand. He took it, rising beside her. The wind shifted, and the smell of river moss and wood smoke drifted between them. "You still believe we can build something?" she asked. "I believe we already are." That night, they didn't sleep by the fire. Russell unrolled their blanket beneath the cottonwoods where the branches whispered and the stars leaked through in pieces. Brielle curled beside him, her head against his chest, his breath slow beneath her ear. "You think they'll talk?" she whispered. "Let him." She fell asleep before he did, her hand tucked into his shirt, her body warm against his. He stayed awake a little longer, watching the wind bend the trees and thinking how rare it was to find something that didn't ask you to be someone else. Winter came early, with frost thick on the grass come morning and the river icing at the edges. But the cabin the McCanns had promised stood firm and dry near the tree line, with a potbelly stove and a loft just tall enough for two children to sleep side by side. Russell worked long hours reinforcing the walls and sealing the eaves. Brielle stitched new curtains from flour sacks and taught the children how to catch heat from the stove without standing too close. One afternoon, while Russell hung a line of jerky to dry, Brielle came to him with a folded paper in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly. "I wrote something," she said. He paused, wiping his hands on his trousers. "For me, for us." She unfolded it, smoothing the creases. Her voice was steady as she read aloud. "I once thought love was a sin when it came too early or too strong or in the wrong shape, but now I know it's the thing that kept me alive, that healed my children. That brought me to a place where I am not ashamed to be whole." She looked up. Russell reached for her hand, rough fingers curling around hers. "I never knew words like that," he said, quiet, "but I feel him." Brielle smiled, and this time it wasn't out of defense or defiance. It was a surrender to something that had already rooted itself deep. He kissed her then slow, without urgency, like he had all the time he'd ever need, and he did. Because they had chosen each other, not out of desperation, but out of knowing. And in that knowing, they had found a life not just worth surviving, but worth building. Together. By mid-December, the river had slowed beneath a glaze of ice, and the cattle clustered near the southern fence where the wind broke softer across the cottonwoods. The cabin held warmth now, not just from the stove, but from the life Brielle and Russell had carved into its corners, dry herbs strung above the kitchen beam, 2 whittled toys on the shelf near the door, and a rag rug the children had helped braid from old clothes. Russell returned from checking the northern fence with a limp in his left leg and a line of blood darkening the side of his trousers. Brielle caught sight of him through the window and was at the door before he reached the porch. "What happened?" "Barbed wire snagged me," he said, brushing snow from his coat. "Didn't see it under the drift." She stepped aside, letting him in. "Sit, let me see." He lowered himself onto the wooden chair near the stove, jaw tight against the pane. Brielle knelt, rolling the fabric back from his calf. The cut was deep but clean, already clotting. "You'll need to keep it dry." "I've had worse," he muttered, but his breath caught when she pressed a cloth soaked in boiled sage. "You always like pretending you're made of granite." "No. Just don't want you worrying more than you already do." She tied the bandage snug, then looked up. "You don't get to decide what I carry. If you hurt, I want to know." He met her eyes, something unspoken settling there like dust after a storm. "All right." That night the wind pressed hard against the walls and snow slid from the roof in heavy thumps. Brielle added a log to the fire, then turned to find Harper standing in the doorway of the loft, blanket around his shoulders. "Mama," he whispered, "is Mr. Vaughn gonna die?" Russell, seated by the hearth, answered before she could. "Not a chance. I got too much left to do." Harper padded over and climbed into his lap without hesitation. Russell shifted to make space, careful not to jostle his leg. Hallie followed, wordless, and curled beside them on the floor. Brielle watched from the table, the glow of the fire casting soft shadows across the room. There was no noise but the crackle of flame and the soft breath of children falling asleep. In the days that followed, Russell's leg kept him close to the cabin. Brielle took up his share of the outside work, hauling water and checking the feed troughs while he taught the children how to trap small game using snares made from scrap wire and willow branches. "You ever miss being alone?" she asked one morning while kneading dough for biscuits. He didn't answer right away. "There's a quiet I miss sometimes, but it's not better than this, just different." She wiped her hands on her apron. I used to think I needed silence to feel safe. And now I just need to know the people around me aren't waiting for me to be someone else. Russell leaned back in the chair, hands resting on his belt buckle. I never wanted different than what you are. You're the first to say that and mean it. I hope I'm the last, too, her hands stilled. You thinking about staying after spring? I was thinking about asking you to marry me. She looked up, startled. Not now, he added quickly. Not until you've had the seasons to decide if this is what you want, but I've already decided. Brielle set the dough aside and stepped toward him. I don't need more seasons. I knew the second you stood in that churchyard and didn't look away. He rose, slow from the stiffness in his leg, and took her hands in his. Then say it. I want to be your wife, Russell Vaughn. There was nothing grand in their embrace, no sweeping gesture, no breathless kiss. Just the quiet press of foreheads, the warmth of their hands between them, and the peace of two people choosing each other with full hearts. The wedding was set for the first thaw. No preacher, no congregation, just Russell, Brielle, the children, and the land that had held them through winter. And when the snow melted from the cottonwood roots and the river ran clear again, they would stand beneath the open sky and vow to walk the rest of their days side by side. Not to forget what had come before, but to build something stronger from its ashes. Because what began in shame had grown into something holy, not by the approval of a town or the blessing of a pulpit, but by the steady, quiet love of a man who saw her fully and stayed. The thaw came slow, creeping in across the hills in thin, wet veins of softened earth and snowmelt. By the time the last of the frost broke from the fence rails, Harper had learned to split kindling straight, and Hallie had taken to following Russell around the cabin yard, asking questions he never seemed to tire of answering. Brielle moved through the days with a steadiness she hadn't known she'd missed. Her hands no longer trembled when she reached for a pail or stitched a seam. She laughed more, not loud or often, but real and without the weight of apology. There was a lightness in her now that didn't come from anything grand, just the quiet rhythm of living alongside someone who saw her clearly. One morning, she stepped outside with a basin of wash water and found Russell adjusting the saddle cinch on his horse. The sun was barely up, sky still streaked with pale blue and ash. You heading out, just to the south ridge. McKen asked me to check the creek, said the ground buckled near the cattle trail. She set the basin down, drying her hands on her skirt. Want company? He reached for her hand. Always. They rode together with the sound of hooves muffled in damp soil. At the ridge, they dismounted and walked the last stretch. The creek had widened, water rushing faster than it had all winter, carving into the sides where the bank had softened. Russell crouched low, running his fingers through the muddy edge. It'll hold for now, but come next hard rain, this path'll be gone. Brielle looked up toward the line of cottonwoods. We'll need a new drive path for spring. I was thinking the same, he said, brushing his hands off on his trousers. We could reroute west, follow the higher ground. Might take longer, but it'll hold. She tilted her head. You already walked it? Last week. You didn't say. He stood, brushing the dirt from his knees. Didn't want to plan anything without talking to you first. Brielle didn't answer right away. She reached out, lacing her fingers through his. You always ask. Even when you don't have to. Because I want you in it, not beside it, in it. She stepped closer. You ever get tired of doing the right thing? He smiled, small and without show. Not when it leads me here. They walked back to the horses in silence, her shoulder brushing his with each step. That night they sat with McCann and his wife at the long pine table, sharing cornbread and boiled greens. The older woman, Ruth, set down her tin cup and folded her hands. Reverend passed through last week, she said, looking between them. Said he's marrying couples out near the mission come full moon. Russell set his fork down. That's so, thought you might like to know, she said, kind but firm. You've been living like man and wife, ain't nobody here who minds, but still, best to make it proper. Brielle raised her chin. We hadn't settled on a date. Well, Ruth said, glancing out the window, full moons in 5 days. The next afternoon, Russell rode into town alone. Brielle didn't ask why. She packed lentils into jars and let Harper and Hallie carry them to the root cellar while she swept the corners of the cabin clean. When he returned, He didn't bring flour or seed or any of the things from the list she'd tucked into his coat pocket. He carried only a small wooden box worn at the corners. He handed it to her without a word and waited. Inside were 2 silver rings, plain and smooth, resting on a piece of folded muslin. She looked up slowly. "You traded your pocket watch," he nodded. "Didn't need to know the time when I already knew the day." They married beneath a sycamore on the bluff, with the children sitting cross-legged in the grass. Ruth stood beside them with a worn Bible, her voice clear and steady. The wind moved gentle through the branches as Russell slid the ring onto Brielle's finger, his hands sure, his eyes never leaving hers. When it was done, Hallie ran to Brielle, arms flung tight around her waist. Harper grabbed Russell's hand and tugged until he knelt, then whispered something into his ear that made him pause, then nod. That night, they didn't return to the cabin. Instead, they camped near the bluff, just the 4 of them, the fire crackling low and the stars sharp overhead. Brielle lay beside Russell, her head on his chest, his arm around her back. The children slept close, bundled in the quilt she'd stitched from old shirts and flour sack scraps. "I didn't think I'd get to have this," she whispered into the dark. He pressed a kiss to her hair. "You didn't get it." "You built it," she smiled. "With you, always with me." In the months that followed, the land greened, and the cattle grew strong on the western pasture. Russell was hired on full-time to manage the herd, and he built a second shed beside the cabin for tools and tack. Brielle started teaching letters and numbers to the McCann girl and 3 others from neighboring homesteads, holding lessons at the long table with chalk and slates. Hallie found a stray pup near the river and named it Pickle. Harper began carving small animals from driftwood, leaving them on the windowsill to dry in the sun. Each night after the work was done and the children tucked in, Brielle and Russell sat on the porch, fingers laced, the quiet settling around them like a blanket. They didn't need to speak. They had said everything in the way they moved through the day, in the bread she left warm by the stove, in the way he kept her tea kettle full, in the way they always waited, always asked, always chose each other. And when the first snow returned, light and soft on the roof, Brielle stood at the window, Russell behind her, his arms around her waist, and whispered, "We're home." They were, because love had come not as salvation, but as steady hands and shared burdens, as quiet evenings and long workdays, as forgiveness without demand and trust earned breath by breath. And in that life of honest labor and quiet joy, they found not just peace, but a happiness that held.